And his small group of economists have been widely discredited. If you look at the mainstream consensus, it is that this is going to be a very difficult time, choppy waters for our economy going forward as a result of Brexit.
Wrong. Patrick Minford was absolutely right about the exchange rate mechanism and the euro against the consensus. I'm sorry I haven't been in for the whole of the debate, but I've been at the Exiting the European Union Select Committee debating one of our reports, and we have been firmly excising split infinitives and making sure that apostrophes appear in the right place and that umble addresses have the correct indefinite article preceding them and all those important matters. But
the transitional arrangements that she set out in her Florence speech, I will.
Very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. Isn't this the whole point between a difference between an implementation and a transition? If it is an implementation, we are implementing the consequences of having left. If it is a transition, we are transitioning from being inside the European Union to being at the end of the process outside, and therefore in the transition we would be de facto members of the European Union on the basis he is setting out, defeating the whole purpose of this bill.
Conservative MP Jacob Rees Mogg. This week he launched an alternative budget for Brexit and being hopelessly optimistic.
Wrong. The fall in prices comes because you make the economy so much more competitive that you take away tariffs, which reduces the price of food potentially by 20%. That's a big reduction. Bear in mind that the biggest tariffs hit food, clothing and footwear, which harm. And the page following indicates spending decisions and tax decisions that have been taken in the budget. But I do, Mr. Speaker, have a very specific question for the Treasury bench in relation to the Red Book, which may have been raised by my honourable friend, the member for Dover, but it is of considerable importance. On page 82 of the Red Book, and it's copied from, I think, page 114 of the ABR's book, in 2022-23, it is said that there will be a £3.5 billion own resources contribution to the European Union. Now, I cannot believe that those wise figures in the ABR or in Her Majesty's Treasury could have made a schoolboy error of just assuming that money paid out in 1 year would continue indefinitely. But it is missing the point that by 2022-23 we will have left the European Union, that the implementation period will have ended, the whole concept of own resources will have ceased to exist. And this is, I feel, rather like spotting an error in Wisden Cricketer's Almanac, something that it's very rare to do and indicates an occasional failing that I hope will be put right, and we will discover that this is not intended.
Prime Minister's Florence speech, the basis on which we are negotiating with the EU, and it is up to them to make their own independent forecast. My understanding, and you will have to, the honourable gentleman will have to speak directly to the ABR about that, but they've used an average of other independent forecasts that have been prepared.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, but I don't think this quite works for the own resources figure because they have made assumptions relating to our net contributions to the European Union, and they have assumed that those monies will be spent domestically in the United Kingdom and that therefore there is no fiscal advantage. But there is still a 3.5 million negative income from own resources. Now,
Jacob Rees Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issue now is not whether it is in the government's interest to publish these documents or not. If the government didn't want to publish them, it should have voted down or amended the humble address. The question now is whether the terms of that motion, which in all precedent is a binding motion, unlike the previous motion passed earlier in the year, which was not a humble address and not a binding motion. To meet this motion, it is not at the discretion of the government to decide what to take out. It is now at the discretion of the Select Committee. Well, may Mrs May live forever. Amen, amen, alleluia, alleluia, amen.
That's a no to you and me, but whether he likes it or not, more and more people are supporting him.
If I say the word monumental to you, how does that make you feel?
Legislation undoubtedly has the importance of primary status. And that is the result of the way in which clauses 2 to 4 retaining most EU-derived legislation is worded, because it turns it principally into secondary legislation in United Kingdom law.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable learned friend, but there seems to me to be one inconsistency in what he's saying, and that is that he has been happy for law to come into this country, which the British government may have voted against, approved by qualified majority vote, to become our senior law, which he objects to being repealed through a statutory instrument which is subject to a parliamentary process in this House and in the other place.
Conservative member of the committee, Jacob Rees Mogg, contempt of Parliament. Why?
Well, the issue is breach of privilege, that a humble address is deemed to be binding, and all previous precedent is that a humble address is binding. And therefore the government has an obligation to meet the terms of that address. It's not now the government's discretion. It has got to fulfil a demand of Parliament.
I want to spend £350 million a week on the health service.
I'm very keen to do that. I didn't like the promise that was made. I even went into vote leave to ask them not to use it. But it was made. And I don't think politicians can get away with saying that if you look at the small print, we didn't really mean it.
Jacob Rees Mogg, darling of many activists.
There are some people who are still very bitter about the result a year ago, and inevitably that colours their behaviour. As long as it's somebody who has accepted that Brexit is happening and will support it properly and won't be a frightful Eeyore, I don't think there'll be a problem. Some of the stories that have come out are serious, others are not, and I think we have to have a question of perspective and balance on this.
Because Jacob Rees Mogg has said that, you know, you've consistently got it wrong over Brexit, that you've been talking it down.
Jacob Rees Mogg himself said this week when he called Mark Carney one of the enemies of Brexit.
In the statutory requirements, the bank is not required to say anything that would not be in the public interest.
And called the BBC the Brexit-bashing corporation.
We haven't suffered as much as you thought, presumably, at this point. But is there, in your opinion, harder times to come?
Well, again, we went with the referendum. What the Bank of England did was to provide a tremendous amount of stimulus immediately after. We did two things. One is we did a number of things to keep the financial system going. That worked on the initial aftermath of the referendum. And then secondly, we cut interest rates and we purchased some assets and we provided a lot of stimulus. The combination of that, plus a much stronger global economy, and the confidence of British households have meant that we have done better. Now, we have not done as well as we would have done if, in the short term, if the vote had gone the other way. Okay. And we've moved, Ranveer, from being the strongest in the G7 to the slowest growing economy in the G7. That's part of this process of adjustment. Okay. It is a short-term issue. It's important, though. Yeah. It's a short-term issue, and I think what's important that people recognize, whatever happens in the negotiation, is we'll make sure inflation stays low, and secondly, we'll make sure the banks stay strong.
Wrong. I think the Canadian example is important, and the honourable lady, my friend from Broxtowe, criticised me for referring to the Canadian Parliament, but it is, in a way, a sister parliament of this one. Of course, I give way.
I'm very grateful to give him an extra minute and say, hear, hear to everything he says.
I'm very grateful because I've always campaigned, and one of the reasons I was so keen to leave the European Union, for the rights of this House. And one of the great rights of this House is to hold the government to account and to use the procedures and facilities open to it to do that in a powerful and real way.
There's a beautiful sky we lay under as the birds discover the meaning of flight forever. A new generation to treasure.